All right, let's talk about the respiratory system today. The idea is that after today you can explain the anatomy of a lung, the mechanism of breathing, the pathway the air needs to take to go into the lungs, reach the alveoli, which is where we have the gas exchange, the oxygen exchange. Then we talk about how the oxygen reaches the cell. We talk about the control of force and depth of breathing, the role in the lungs of the serous membranes, which is very important. We briefly touch on the sinuses, and also where do we phonate, which means where do we make vocals, where do we vocalize, where do we speak from. The lungs are the organs that harvest oxygen from the atmosphere, and that's, as a system, is the respiratory system. The lungs are where we have the gas exchange. They pick up oxygen and then they get rid of gaseous waste, such as carbon dioxide. It also has a very important function in maintaining the body's acid and base balance. It does that together with the kidneys. So this slide is actually very interesting, but basically the kidneys and the lung work together, balancing the acid and bases in the cardiovascular system, which is very, very important. Let's have an overview of the respiratory processes. In order to reach the body cells, atmospheric oxygen has to travel from the outside through air passages, and then it has to ventilate the lungs. Oxygen travel, we call that oxygen transport, when we talk about that as a title. And the air passages, where the air has to travel to get into the smallest parts of the lungs, we call that the conducting zone, because that's the area where the air is going just through pipes. There's no exchange of gases. It's just the traveling of the air to the proper places. And then within the smallest little air sacs, the alveoli, where we have the gas exchange, the oxygen will do that and will go from the air into the blood. So it will diffuse into the pulmonary capillaries. The alveoli is the respiratory zone in the lungs, which is mean we have a gas exchange. And the oxygen moving from the lungs into the blood is called external respiration, because when the blood then travels through the tissues in need, it diffuses from the blood into the cell, and that's known as internal respiration. And carbon dioxide is removed from the body in a same reversing process, with the same pathway, basically. The airways transport inspired and expired air. They consist of the upper and the lower air passages. So that's ventilation, just bringing the air into the lungs. The upper airways have as a passage, but they also warm and humidify and purify the air. Most passageways are kept moist by a mucous membrane. If you feel your mouth, that's a mucous membrane, that moisture in there that you feel. Goblet cells and seromucous glands are the ones that secrete the mucus, and we feel the mucus when we spit out the mucus, because we have beating cilia, which are a stratified ciliated epithelium as a tissue type, and they ongoingly transport foreign materials that are trapped in this mucus to the exterior. It's kind of cool. You can see the little beating cilia down here, and here we have a picture where we also see some of the goblet cells and seromucous glands that secrete the mucus. Up here we can see an overview of the upper respiratory tract and then the lower respiratory tract. So we are now in the upper respiratory tract. We're going to continue with the nasal cavity, pharynx, and larynx, and then make our way down until we reach the lungs, where we have the gas exchange. So this all at this point is part of the conducting zone. Air first passes by a ring of short hairs within the nasal vestibule, which is the entrance of the nose, and they are there to guard against foreign bodies before the air moves into the two nasal cavities. The turbinates, the nasal conchas, remember we talked about those in the skull. What they do is they enlarge the surface area within the nasal cavities, and they're also shaped that the air the air will slow down and sort of circulate, and the air will be passing by those conchas quite extensively, and that helps warm, moisten, and purify the air. You will feel that when you go in a cold climate in the winter and you breathe through your mouth, you kind of get a burning down into the tracheal area, the chest sometimes, and when you breathe through the nose, it is much more it's a much more pleasant experience in the lungs. Venous plexi within the mucous membrane of the concha can swell markedly and expand the nasal surface area if we need to. So this is where we get the warming from these venous plexi. So it's not just the surface area, it's also the fact that we can engorge that area with warming blood if necessary. The sinuses, paranasal sinuses, which are created, they're around the nose, paranasal, and we have a few of them. We have the frontal here in the frontal bone. We have the ethmoid in the ethmoid bone right here, in where the nose is, just behind the nose. And we also have sphenoid sinuses lying within the sphenoid bone, as well as maxillary sinuses lying within the maxilla. You can feel those sinuses very, not nicely, but heavily when they are when you have a sinusitis. You know where the pressure points are. What they do is they warm inspired air, but they also create resonance chambers for voice. So I think mine are probably quite large in there. They connect to the nasal cavity if their mucous membranes get infected. And so what happens is excessive mucus can block the openings of this connection and trap it, which of course then that causes the sinusitis. The maxillary sinus are most vulnerable to this problem because the rounding of the drainage of the maxillary sinus is almost like it's upward. So if you see the meatai, it's kind of hard to see these things, but here's the one that goes for the maxillary sinus right there. And so that one has to like an uphill battle, so guess what? It fills up, and that can hurt. We can use a neti potty to sort of get stuff flushed out, and now you can understand why a neti potty might help. A neti potty is basically a warm water with a little bit of salt type solution in it, and you pour it in one nostril and you flush out the other side and try to drain all this area in here from problematic bacteria and so forth. And so you decrease the swelling. It can be very, very helpful and really clear up. It's a little uncomfortable at first, but if you overcome that initial, it's kind of a relieving feeling. Posterior, the nasal cavity connects to the nasopharynx, which is the first section of the pharynx. So the pharynx is sort of a place where we share food and air. Well, the nasopharynx, we hopefully don't share too much food, but it's kind of a place where we share the two. We can have food coming out of our nose if it has to. It's connected. Hopefully that won't happen. Inferiorly, the oropharynx, below the nasopharynx, then is where it's right behind the mouth, and we really share that area. Going in there and then going below that is where we get the laryngopharynx, or it's also known as the hypopharynx, which is where the larynx starts, that then separates the food from the air going into the trachea, which is the air tube. In the back we have the esophagus, which is usually a collapsed tube, as you can see down here, because the food can push it open. The trachea has to stay open. The air is not strong enough to push it open every time. The larynx is known as the voice box because this is where we do vocalization and we make sound in there. The larynx has the ability to close the lower air passages and make it possible to raise the thoracic and abdominal pressure, which helps us strain or when we need a cough. So that's another function that the larynx brings to the table. All right, let's leave it at that, and we'll pick it up on the next section.